I don't want no oil, a spoil in my shoreline. I like fish much better than crud. I like birds and things, creeping and crawling. Won't trade no more oil for blood. The sun done give us all we need to make this country run. But that black demon oil's got us fussing and fighting, and I do believe it's time we was done. I don't want them nukes run by them kooks who think radioactivity is fun. No more three-headed frogs or kids with leukemia. Nuclear power ain't fit for a dog. The sun done give us all we need to make this country run. But that nuclear power's got us fussing and fighting, and I do believe it's time we was done. No nukes!
Good morning, Toledo, and good afternoon, Columbus, and hello to everyone in Bowling Green or listening on the internet, wherever or whenever you may be. My name is Joseph D. DeMare, and I'm here with my co-host, who is always hungry and thirsty for righteousness.
And pretty much just always hungry and thirsty, too.
Rebecca Wood. For the next hour, we're going to be roaming all over the world on our program For a Green Future. For a Green Future is a show where we talk about ecology and the environment, and we talk about them in the ways that they affect you, your wealth, your health, your happiness, and the wealth and happiness of your friends and family, and the health and happiness of the Yanomamo people of Brazil, the Zapotec of Mexico, the Haudenosaunee of Anishinaabe or Cree in the United States, the Eskimo Inuit or Sami, the Malayic or Barito peoples, the Yi or Karenic peoples, the Kunapa or the Mimdi, or any of the 5,000 or so indigenous tribes around the world, as well as those of us without a tribal identity. Because whoever you call my people, all peoples are hanging onto the surface of this spinning ball in space we call Earth. For the next 10 minutes or so, we're going to be talking about ecological and environmental observations. Then we managed to get a very special guest this week, Karin Kvale, called in all the way from New Zealand. She's going to be talking about a topic we've been trying to cover for a very long time, that is, the effects of microplastics on plankton. Then, at the bottom of the hour, we'll hear from our patrons and sponsors, to whom we are always grateful. After that, we'll hear from Rebecca. Rebecca, what's your topic for this week?
Poison ivy, basically. Poison ivy. And maybe sort of the Bearsden conservation area in Massachusetts. Bearsden, I think.
Bearsden. An interesting topic. Poison ivy is definitely adding some color to the local trails around Bowling Green, and maybe still adding some color to hikers as well. After we hear from Rebecca, it'll be ecological news from around the planet. There's some good news from off the coast of Martha's Vineyard, some evil news from France, who seems to be more and more bent on destroying the planet lately, and a victory for solar in Ohio, which may prove to be a loss for the environment. This is a pre-recorded show, recorded on Thursday, October 26th. So you can't call into the show live, but you can call or text 419-973-5841, or send us an email at foragreenfutureradio@gmail.com at any time. And we'll do our best to incorporate your comments into our next show. So, speaking of color, it's finally happening. Fall is here. There was the first frost in Ohio this week, about 2 weeks later than average. And so the trees that have been holding off turning are all rushing into brilliant oranges, reds, and yellows. There's one tree in our Bowling Green neighborhood that's particularly beautiful this year, with reddish-orange leaves that seem to be glowing on the outside, that then transition to bright yellow in the interior leaves.
Ooh, that
It
is
was
pretty.
so pretty, we had to take a picture,
Pretty.
and we'll use that picture for this week's thumbnail for our YouTube and podcast pages. Of course, the next day after the first frost, the temperature went up to 85 degrees in Northwest Ohio. This week, I'm actually broadcasting from Florida via Zoom. It was just as warm as in Ohio as it was here. The temperatures have stayed well above average, but the weather people are predicting we may actually get some snowflakes next week. But globally, even if by some miracle temperatures start plunging, 2023 will still be the hottest year in human history, far surpassing the old record in 2016. El Nino is in full swing, barreling eastward along the equator before blasting South America like a blowtorch. Remember, Peru had temperatures of over 100 degrees in the middle of its winter just a few weeks ago. That's just a taste of the heat waves to come. The news reports are filled with climate scientists expressing shock and awe at just how quickly and how much the globe is heating up. More than one has said that they couldn't understand how September could have shattered old records by such huge margins. But we understand, don't we, Rebecca?
We certainly do. Positive feedback loop.
That's right. Positive feedback loops, that pesky physical phenomenon which is rushing us ever more rapidly towards climate doom. Still, the pending climate catastrophes make it all the more important to cherish the beautiful nature we do have right now. Forests migrate, and they move across the landscape in response to claiming climates. In fact, there was a time roughly 50 million years ago when palm trees grew in the Arctic. Right now, spruce trees are racing north by tree standards into the Arctic. The Arctic tundra biome is not supposed to have trees. It's too cold and the growing season is too short. It's supposed to be a barren open land covered in grasses and fast-growing annuals that can blossom in a very short time. But that is changing very rapidly. In fact, the changing climate is happening too rapidly for many trees to make the move northward. The Southwest desert is becoming too hot and dry even for Joshua trees to survive.
Man.
The giant sequoia in Sequoia National Park are being threatened by global warming. Locally, we've almost completely lost birch trees. Once, not long ago, you could find paper birch all over the area. Birch bark was an essential commodity for the indigenous people. You could peel off bark in huge sheets that you could use to make canoes or cover the frame of a wigwam. There aren't any such huge old birches with healthy bark around here anymore. Maples were also extremely important for local tribes. Being able to make maple syrup, maple candies, and maple sugar was so desirable that tribes would often fight over areas that had a high percentage of maple trees. Sugar maples actually require a lot of snow on the ground to provide an insulating layer that protects their roots. 8 inches is the minimum that sugar maples need. Without that, the ground actually freezes deeper and longer in the coldest part of the winter, which causes them to grow up to 40% slower. They're also more susceptible to diseases like fungi that prefer warm weather. It's gotten so bad over recent years that even Vermont's maple sugar industry is being threatened. Maples are some of the most brilliant trees that are turning right now, so take advantage of this opportunity. There may not be that many more in the future. Take pictures, press leaves. Does anyone remember pressing leaves in books? Rebecca, did you ever do that?
I don't think I ever did that. I used to just bring home leaves that I found on walks and just kind of like put them around the house, though, on shelves and things. It's kind of like a way of bringing the experience of the walk back with me, I think.
My mother pressed a couple leaves in her youth, but it's certainly a pastime long since fallen out of purview. Well, this is the year to do it at last, because we don't know how many more years maples will be with us. But we're going to stay with you just as long as we possibly can, despite the algorithms that may be arrayed against us in the virtual world. Just a update on our rant of last week about how YouTube is steadily whittling away our views, it did seem that you folks responded to our request that you watch the video version. We got a definite surge in views and likes. However, there are still no comments, even though several listeners told us they definitely tried to leave some. We'll have to wait and see if YouTube lets us keep these views, or if they will, like others, deem them inauthentic and delete them. We also have a little bit of an update on the Canadian wildfires. As we reported before, Canada has stopped updating its official wildfire reports. However, there is satellite data that identifies hotspots. These are the areas where fires are currently burning. It's a very crude tool, though, because each pixel on the heat map covers a very broad area and can contain several separate fires. As of October 26th, there were approximately 40 hotspots identified that indicate a fire or multiple fires. Almost all the fires were in British Columbia, with just a half dozen or so in Alberta. So it would appear the fire season there is finally winding down. At its height, there were fires in every Canadian province. Let's hope next year is not nearly as bad a fire season for Canada as this year. So, to tie the Canadian forest fires back into talking about fall, way back in July of 2022, we interviewed Ralph Blomers, executive producer of the film Elemental, which was all about wildfires, and how cutting forests down after fire has been through it is possibly the worst possible thing you can do. The film has gone on to have a great deal of critical success. In fact, he just did a special showing for the United States Congress, and it's sold out in many smaller venues like the Chautauqua Institute. Anyway, one of the points he makes in the film is that allowing leaf litter to build up on your roof, in gutters, or next to structures is one of the main ways buildings catch fire and are destroyed by wildfires.
Wow, who'd have thunk it? I guess it makes sense though.
Yeah, you've got to keep those leaves off your house. Leaves are great for composting or in gardens. Each year, we try to put the bulk of our leaves we rake up into our fenced-in garden enclosure. After piling them up, a couple of feet high, we add a couple of bags of composted manure, and by spring, they're almost all broken down into the topsoil. Something for you at home to consider instead of just raking them to the curb or taking them to the dump. Something else to consider is how dependent we are on this planet on the microscopic life called plankton. Plankton has been around since the dawn of life on this planet, but right now it's facing a threat unlike any it's faced in a billion years. That's microplastics. Our guest today has had many years studying plankton and has done some research that highlights a threat to life in the oceans. We'll let her tell you exactly how throwing plastic on the ground here in Ohio can pose a threat to all life in the oceans. Let's go to that interview now. Hello, and welcome to For a Green Future. Could we start off with your name and who you're with?
Sure. My name is Karin Kvale, and I am a carbon cycle scientist at GNS Science in New Zealand. So this is a federal research institute. It would be something akin to the USGS, just on a much smaller scale.
So today we want to talk about plankton and microplastics. Could we start off with reminding our listeners about what exactly plankton is and what role does it play in the Earth's ecosystem?
Yeah, okay. So plankton, these are tiny floating organisms that are all over in all parts of the ocean. We have phytoplankton. So this is a general term for the floating plants. So these are photosynthesizers. They grow and they die, and over the course of their lifetimes, they're producing organic particles, and these settle down the water column. So as these particles are settling, they rot. And as they rot, they leave behind their carbon. And this is what we call the biological carbon pump. Okay, and that's really responsible for storing a lot of carbon in the ocean. So if all the phytoplankton died off, atmospheric CO2 would, within centuries, shoot up nearly 200 parts per million. So They are really important for the global carbon cycle. The other thing about these particles is when they're settling and they're rotting, that rotting consumes oxygen. So they're also responsible for removing oxygen from the water column. Now, phytoplankton also produce oxygen because they're photosynthesizers, so they're producing oxygen on the surface. And it's this balance between production in the upper ocean of oxygen and loss of oxygen in the deep ocean that helps to determine how much oxygen is in the ocean and how well the ocean can support life for the higher trophic levels. And then we have zooplankton. So zooplankton are the animals that eat the phytoplankton, and their eating of this phytoplankton it helps to keep the phytoplankton populations in check. And also they poop. And when those fecal pellets sink, those are another branch of the biological carbon pump because those fecal pellets rot. That rotting leaves behind carbon and it consumes oxygen. And these zooplankton also form the base of the food web, so they're feeding the larger ocean animals. So both the phytoplankton and the zooplankton are really important for sustaining life in the oceans, including the fish we eat, the sea creatures that we appreciate, and the cycling of carbon.
Sounds like there's a wide variety of plankton and uses for them. How many different species of plankton are there, or recorded, I suppose? Could you describe one or two of your favorites?
Okay, so there are at least 20,000 different species of phytoplankton. One of my favorites are the coccolithophore group, because this is something that I based my PhD on. But they're really special because when they bloom, they're also forming calcium carbonate shells, just really tiny shells. And when they bloom, they slough off these cells, and it makes a beautiful milky color in the water. But this production of calcium carbonate is also really important to regulating climate over long time scales. So they're special to me. And then I guess for zooplankton, if you know SpongeBob SquarePants, plankton in that show, that's a copepod. And copepods are really cool because they hibernate, and they will actually spend months at a time in the winter deep in the ocean away from light, just living off their fat reserves.
I don't remember that in the show, but maybe
No,
behind
it's
the
not in
scenes.
the show.
Yeah. Plankton have been around for a long time, haven't they? I think it's safe to say the current challenge they face in the microplastic pollution is fairly recent, though. How much microplastic is there in the ocean? Is there more microplastic than plankton?
Probably not.
That's
so
good.
we
Good
we probably have at least 1,000 times more phytoplankton in the ocean than microplastic. In terms of contamination of the ocean right now, it's highly uncertain, but we're probably looking at order trillions of grams of plastic in the global ocean. But do watch this space because a lot of research groups are trying to figure this out right now. Phytoplankton have been around at least 1 billion years. So really a very long time. They're really fundamental to the whole functioning of the biogeochemistry of the Earth system.
They're older than sharks, right? It's
Yeah.
a common thing that sharks are one of the oldest species in the ocean, but phytoplankton are more ancient than that.
Yeah.
So when plankton encounters microplastics in the ocean, they sometimes do end up eating them in their attempts to get nutrients. How exactly how are they eating them? What's that process look like? And how toxic is plastics to plankton?
Okay, so that's a big question, and there's a lot we still don't know. So research in this direction started by putting zooplankton like copepods in tanks and then dosing them with really high concentrations of microplastics and no other foods to see how they would respond. And they can get their little feelers get tangled up in fibers. They can eat them if they get really hungry. They'll see these and they'll eat them. But of course, in the real ocean, it's a lot more complicated. There's other sources of food. The concentrations of microplastics are a lot lower than happened in these tank experiments. But there are three things that we know for sure at this point. So plastics, microplastics included, they make a great habitat for phytoplankton because they tend to float. The buoyant ones, they float where it's warm, there's lots of sunlight. And this encourages the development of biofilms. Okay, so these biofilms, when they form on microplastics, it makes them sticky. And then they tend to clump with phytoplankton cells. And this is probably changing how the organic particles are settling in the ocean because the plastics tend to be quite buoyant. So it might be changing the sinking rates of these organic particles. But these biofilms also make the microplastics more attractive to zooplankton. They can get confused. They think, oh, this is a nice, juicy phytoplankton cell, and then they eat it. And now sometimes some zooplankton will spit it out, but not always. Because we have a wide variety of zooplankton in the ocean with different feeding behaviors, and also there's lots of different kinds of microplastic floating in the ocean, we don't really understand yet what the net effect is going to be in terms of how it affects the biological carbon pump.
Can you speak to what happens as to when the zooplankton actually do start eating that biofilm, or is that the current area of research? We don't know enough yet.
Yeah, I mean, when they eat them, they will poop them out.
Okay.
So it's, and then these are packaged in fecal pellets and they're sinking. It will alter the properties of the fecal pellet, so it can make the fecal pellets break apart a lot more easily, and then potentially you're losing your carbon from the fecal pellets higher in the water column, which then has implications for global carbon cycling.
So your research says that plankton eating microplastics can actually lower oxygen levels in the ocean. How does that work more specifically? You can get as technical as you'd like. And how long would it take oceans to recover from the deoxygenation?
Okay, so I think I mentioned already that the zooplankton will help to keep the phytoplankton populations in check.
Yes.
So what I've demonstrated with modeling is in a very theoretical, idealized framework. If you start to allow zooplankton to eat microplastics instead of phytoplankton, then the phytoplankton start to bloom and you get an increase in the biomass of the phytoplankton, which means they're producing more organic material, which is then sinking through the water column. There's more rotting that happens, and then there's a greater loss of oxygen in the water column. So in my modeling framework, this is what happens. And this is how we end up losing water column oxygen from zooplankton eating the microplastic. So this has been demonstrated theoretically in this model. We haven't actually seen this in the open ocean. So there are now research groups that are looking into this. But theoretically, if this happens, and if it happens in the real ocean, climate change can potentially make this problem worse, because as we're warming the ocean, it's warming from the top. And this is producing a stratification, so it's stabilizing the water column, which means you end up getting less mixing, less air-sea gas exchange, which inhibits the recovery of oxygen. So if you get an anomaly, you get this reduction of oxygen. If you also then start to stabilize the surface ocean, then that anomaly, there's no way to recover this. Likewise, in the Southern Ocean, if you lose sea ice, then this can produce a trapping of deoxygenation, because the sea ice actually will trap the oxygen that the phytoplankton make and hold it in the water column. But if you lose the sea ice, then the oxygen ends up degassing to the atmosphere, and this will perpetuate this oxygen loss and make it potentially harder to recover from.
Is the situation hopeless? It sounds like this would be initiate a process that maybe even the removal of microplastics from the system wouldn't be able to reverse. Would plankton be able to recover from the introduction of microplastics?
We don't know. So it seems that there are bacteria in the ocean that are eating microplastics, consuming this just directly, which is great, but this will change the ocean food web in ways we really do not understand yet. I think when it comes to thinking about the implications of microplastic, we do have to accept, like with climate change, there will be impacts, there will be negative impacts, and there's very little that we can do about that at this point, and focus on preventing further harm.
Well, this certainly adds urgency to the need to stop putting plastic back into the environment, into our oceans. We're sorry to tell you that currently the United States is not doing well on that front. You're probably aware of that. We're having trouble just getting plastic bag bans in place on the local level. How is it over there in New Zealand?
Well, so the government up until last week had committed to phasing out the single-use and the hard-to-recycle plastics, but we've just had a change in government, and their policies will be probably very different on the environmental front. So we're still waiting for some announcements on this. New Zealand has joined the High Ambition Coalition in this ongoing plastics treaty. So the United Nations Environment Assembly is now negotiating an international plastics regulation treaty. New Zealand is a part of that. So trying to really make meaningful progress on regulation of plastics from across the whole life cycle. The US hasn't signed yet, but this would be something that you could push for domestically.
We'll try.
But,
we'll certainly try.
Yeah. I don't know. I think New Zealand still has a lot of problems with respect to how they deal with their plastic issues also, because 75% of our recycling is exported overseas, probably to the developing world, where it's not being managed properly. It's getting burnt in cement kilns. It's being dumped in the environment. So I think probably your export rates are lower in Ohio, just because your economy is different, but it's still, I think, really important to hold your local governments to account and find out where that recycling is going and how it's being dealt with.
Well, we'll try to continue to do our best. Thanks so much for joining us. Is there anything final you'd like to add for our listeners?
Yeah. Well, I mean, I could point out that microplastics contamination isn't just a faraway ocean problem, because we have a lot of microplastics in the atmosphere over land also. So we're all probably breathing this stuff in. It's probably in your drinking water. Indoor environments are especially contaminated. Yeah. So we still don't have a good sense of how this might be affecting human health, but it is something to consider.
All right. Thanks again for telling some more about the problem.
We hope you enjoyed that little trip to New Zealand and the exploration of the world's oceans. Now it's time to consider something closer to home. It's time to hear from our patrons and sponsors.
For a Green Future is also brought to you by the Wood County Park District. The Wood County Park District is a natural resources conservation agency. They protect natural spaces, maintain quality green spaces, provide engaging programming, and they teach people to love and respect nature. They also restore wildlife habitats and lead people on outdoor adventures. Wood County Parks protects natural spaces in Wood County for all to enjoy from 8 a.m. to 30 minutes past sunset every day of the year. There are several ways to get a hold of them and find out what's happening. One is to call them at 419-353-1897. Another is to visit their website, www.wcparks.org. The website again is www.wcparks.org. They are also available on all social media, Instagram, Facebook, Twitter, and many others. Just search for WC Parks. That's the Wood County Park District, and we're very grateful for their support.
For a Green Future is brought to you by our patrons. These are wonderful people who've gone to patreon.com, that's Patreon. There they searched for a Green Future. Up popped our wonderful Patreon page that shows different levels of memberships and has a bunch of cool photos on it. There they picked the level membership that matched their monthly budget, and every month a little bit comes out of their account, comes over to us, And that's how we could afford to keep this show on the air. So we are extremely grateful to our patrons, and if you want to become one, just go to patreon.com and search for a Green Future. Thank you.
Okay, Rebecca, time to talk about poison ivy. What do you have for us this week?
Alrighty, well, poison ivy is in the genus Toxicodendron. So it's almost like it's toxic or something.
Oh.
It's closer to home in a lot of different places because it's native to Asia and North America. You got 3 basic species: radicans, which is in East Canada, Mexico, California, I think, and parts of the Caribbean. And then you got Ridderbergi, which is in Canada, the US, not in the southeastern US. And Toxicodendron orientale, which is in East Asia, basically. And the thing it's famous for, of course, is causing contact dermatitis, which means it makes you itch.
Technical name, yeah.
This is caused by something called urushiol, which is not like one of the archangels like it sounds. It's the angel of itching. It's a clear liquid compound in the sap of poison ivy, which is not, by the way, a true ivy, but is in the cashew and pistachio family. And that radicans is actually eaten by many birds and animals. So I don't know if it makes them itchy a little bit, or no, doesn't make them itchy. I guess not.
Probably not birds.
I don't know.
They probably have a different physiology.
Yeah, that makes sense, I guess. Yeah, poison ivy can grow as small plants, shrubs, or climbing vines. The leaves can be elliptical or egg-shaped, and the edges of the leaves can be smooth, lobed, or toothed, sometimes on the same plant. So that's helpful when you're trying to identify it. It does grow in clusters of 3 leaflets. So the saying "leaves of 3, let it be" is that holds up. The leaf clusters alternate on the stem. You have one on one side, one on the other, and it's got white berries in the fall. Also, extreme dermatitis can lead to blisters and even anaphylaxis. So this interests me because my mother has a bad poison ivy allergy. Like, she gets actual oozing sores.
Oh,
Poison ivy, it's really not good. Apparently 15 to 25% of people have no reaction to poison ivy, but they can have greater results or greater reaction, a magnified reaction with repeated exposure. So this is something I heard as a child. If don't get cocky if you don't have no reaction to poison ivy.
right.
There's always that one guy who's got to roll in it to be like, oh look, see, it doesn't itch me at all. And if he does that enough times, then it will. Maybe in some cases. Also interesting, the water in the blisters does not spread the dermatitis. I thought it did.
Ah, yes. That's something you hear too, is don't stop the blisters.
Yeah, apparently what's actually going on there, people think it does because it crops up in other parts of the body after you've had the blisters and they've broken and leaked. What's actually going on with that is that you've had a lesser exposure on that part of your body. So it appears later. So you get the intense exposure to the urushiol will blossom first, and then the dermatitis will show up other places where you've gotten a lesser exposure. Also, sometimes other people in the household can leave urushiol on other objects. Like my mom did our laundry, for example. So she would keep getting reinfected that way. So that's not good at all. Another famous family story. Apparently, there was an incident once where my grandfather, Grandpa Lyle, and his father, Great Grandpa Charlie, went camping together, and it was apparently primitive camping, and Grandpa Charlie used the wrong kind of leaves as toilet paper, and Grandpa Lyle really loved telling this story over and over again till the end of his life. he didn't get along real well with his dad, so apparently he really cherished the memory of that incident.
Yeah, I mean, if it happens once, you never let anybody forget about it.
Yeah, exactly. So yeah, it was a little small light of comfort in his old age, I guess, remembering that. Um, despite that, the family tradition of camping has continued into the next generation. Which brings us to my uncle David went on Grandpa Lyle's son went on a camping trip recently. He sent me some stuff about that I wanted to relate about the Bearsden Conservation Area. Bearsden, sorry, it's Bearsden because it's named after people thought actual bears denned around there.
There's
Apparently.
Ben, right?
But yeah, there were no incidents of poison ivy. I guess that Uncle David has learned from that story.
Were there bears in Bearsden?
You did not see any bears or any
Oh.
poison ivy, so that was good. It's near Athol, Massachusetts. I'm not sure how you pronounce that. No snickering, people from Maine. But according to their local parks trail section of the city website, the Bearsden Conservation Area has 10 miles of trail, 1,568 acres of forest. It's got the Millers River running through it, and it's got a bunch of like little climbing hills you can go up on and look down on the river, which is fun. It's got cabins and shelters. That's where Uncle David stayed. It's named after people thought there were bears' dens in the hills. This is controversial because there are no actual caves, just a bunch of rocky ledges and crevices in those hills. And there's some other area around there that has actual caves that bears could have been living in. So yeah, I don't know. Nobody really knows whether there are actually bears have been seen in that area, definitely, but nobody knows if they're living in the caves in those hills.
The classic local tall tale, right? There has to be bears up there.
Yeah,
my cousin saw one.
Right, exactly. The highest peak is something called Pratt Hill, which is 1,282 feet above sea level. There's also something called Indian Crossing, which was part of a Native American trade route down the Millers River from southern New England to Canada, and maybe over here to Ohio, because that's people used to, people don't know Northern Ohio was part of this big trade route where you go from the Atlantic down the St. Lawrence Seaway and then down the Maumee, connect to the Ohio, connect to Mississippi, bam, you're in the Gulf of Mexico. You can trade you can get little shells to decorate things with. But yeah, there's also an alleged Indian cornfield that someone took pictures of, but no one knows where it is anymore. Allegedly, it was near it's near Round Top Hill. It might have been the Pequot, possibly. They were growing corn there, and the picture looks similar to some other Pequot, but nobody really knows if there was really, like, nobody can find that cornfield where it used to be exactly. So nobody knows. There's something called Sheep Rock, which is a nice rock shelf with a view of the river and the ledges and across the river. And something called 20 Hilltops, which is an extension of the White Mountains, apparently. I think those are in Connecticut, maybe. I think it's near the Connecticut border, not really sure. They got fishing access, including a special catch and release section. There's a Newton Reservoir, the Duck Pond, and the Oxbow picnic area, and something called the 1,000-acre swamp, which does not sound very much like the 3-acre wood that Winnie the Pooh had. So don't go expecting that, but it is a good place to view birds and wildlife, apparently. And according to the Athol Daily News, in an article from 2019 by Kathy Chasen, that includes cedar waxwing and viceroy butterflies. And also, the main point of the article was it's considered to be one of the wildest places in Massachusetts because there are no interior roads or river crossings. So that's kind of neat.
Wow, that's cool. Yeah, do they allow off-trail hiking? You can just walk around back there?
I don't know who's going to stop you. It doesn't sound like there's really anybody around.
The bears. Must be the bears.
Yeah, the bears. Yeah. I don't know if the bears know what the trails that you're supposed to stay on. I don't know if they respect the trails.
Now it's time for our ecological news section. For our first story, TheGuardian.com has an unfortunate report on how the European Union seems to have abandoned its promise to ban toxic chemicals in consumer products.
Ew.
3 years ago, on October 14th, 2020, the EU published a chemicals strategy for sustainability as part of its zero pollution ambition. This included general language like, quote, banning the most harmful chemicals in consumer products and allowing their use only where essential, unquote, and specific callouts like phasing out polyfluoroalkyl substances, also known as PFAS. It also touched on other sectors in an effort to promote sustainability, like banning caged farming or certain chemical exports. But all of these are missing from the official 2024 European Commission Work Program released on October 17th of this year. This is the schedule of objectives and initiatives and a rough timetable of the same that will guide the EU as they start the new year. We took a quick look at this report. The EU will continue to focus on wind power and water resilience, especially as they relate to their 2040 climate target. But this timeline is far too slow, and Europe especially needs to focus on the impact of rampant chemical use on their population before it's too late. Europe has almost 23% of the world's new cancer cases, with only 6% of the world's population, according to the European Environment Agency, a network of environmental citizens organizations. Tatiana Santos, head of chemicals policy there, has renamed the European Green Deal the European Toxic Deal, saying, quote, the European Commission has betrayed European citizens, turning a blind eye to chemical pollution. It is now clear that the profits of the chemical industry are more important to this commission than the health of Europeans, unquote. Chronic exposure to pollutants and chemical carcinogens as a result of the weak chemical regulations could be causing health issues across the continent, and putting it as an important issue in the 2024 work program would go a long way towards fixing the damage to the health and happiness of the population and the environment. It might come as no surprise to our listeners that it seems this regulation was weakened by the direct influence of industry. According to documents acquired by The Guardian earlier this year, there was some chemical regulation being considered, but the influence of powerful companies and figures, such as President of France Emmanuel Macron, seems to have led to what he called a European regulatory break. Back in May of this year, he wanted to pause on regulations, supposedly in order for industries to be able to catch up. But the free market doesn't really work that way. Unless a body of authority forces companies to change, they just will continue to make money as quickly as easily as they can. With chemicals like PFAS continuing to be unregulated, the potential health of our future generations is suffering immeasurable harm, and we must cease our current levels of contamination. It's been suggested by the European Green Party to make legislation on chemicals an important issue in Europe's June 2024 elections. We'd certainly like to see more citizen feedback and accountability on this topic. These last few weeks, we've had a few reports on how beneficial offshore wind farms can be in achieving our emission goals. So this week, we'd like to acknowledge how far along the United States is in this area. The answer is not much. This past April, the United States issued its first turbine installation clearance for a commercial-scale offshore wind farm. That'll be for the South Fork Wind Project, which cleared the way for turbine construction off of Rhode Island and New York. The U.S. Bureau of Safety and Environmental Enforcement was behind the certification process, which inherited the regulations directly governing offshore renewables from the Bureau of Ocean Energy Management back in January. The BOEM still has some say in the process leading up to approval and installation, but the process is handed off to the BSEE after completing environmental and technical reviews. There are 16 other offshore projects in the pipeline, so to speak, and if all of them are approved, they would generate in total more than 22 gigawatts of electricity. The South Fork Wind Project will have about 123 megawatts of electricity generation when it's completed in a few months, and is one of 2 offshore wind farms that have cleared the complete approval process. The other is the Vineyard project near Boston, Massachusetts. We're also happy to report that Vineyard Wind's first turbine installation was completed on October 18th, this past week. It'll likely be a full year or more before Vineyard's farm is fully operational, but it will provide 800 megawatts of renewables, powering more than 400,000 homes and businesses. These projects were both approved back in 2021 by the BOEM, but it's taken 2 years for the government to figure out exactly how they want to regulate offshore wind power. Both of these projects are partially backed by offshore wind farm companies based in Europe, who, it must be noted, have had offshore wind for more than 30 years. Back in 1991, the town of Vindby in Denmark installed 11 turbines offshore for a total of 5 megawatts of generation, enough to power 2,200 Danish households. And the United Kingdom and China, especially, have firmly seized the opportunity for easy energy over the past decades. We've talked about the UK's wind farms of the past. Their total generation is second in the world, reporting 13.6 gigawatts in 2022. China is actually the world's leader in offshore wind generation, with over 25 gigawatts of production. So, all that being said, it's not exactly like the United States is trailing behind its fellows in terms of offshore wind power generation. It's more like we finally learned where the starting line is, and we'll likely never be able to catch up with the UK and China. There's a short story here from scientificamerican.com that tries to answer the question of what to do after the glaciers melt. We touched in our introduction about the degradation of the land. The disappearing glaciers are exposing vast new ecosystems that need protection. It's well known that globally, alpine glaciers are melting as a result of human-caused higher temperatures. The area covered by glaciers currently could be reduced significantly by the end of this century, and that would basically create new ecosystems where there was once ice and snow. In Antarctica and Greenland alone, alpine glaciers cover about 650,000 kilometers. It's been one of the most striking pieces of evidence to witness their slow retreat year after year. Models have suggested that the decline of glaciers would produce the most new land, so to speak, in Alaska and in the mountains of Asia. And this could represent one of the largest ecosystem changes in history. According to the Conservatory of Natural Areas in Haute-Savoie, France, around 78% of exposed terrain from the loss of glaciers would be on land, as opposed to fresh or salt water. Guidelines should be set to protect these pristine areas before they're contaminated by human interference. It's even pointed out that this new terrain could be used as a kind of emergency carbon dioxide storage. The plants that colonize the area fresh would offset the deforestation that's happening elsewhere in the world. But for right now, fingers crossed, yeah. But for right now, scientists are gaining new insights as to the methods of how microorganisms, plants, and animals move into fresh areas. And that could be a little inspiring if you look at it the right way. Even the failure of humanity to protect its alpine glaciers can lead us to understand a little bit more about our world. But as always, we still have the chance to protect the current state of things if we band together and take enough action to reverse our current climate trajectory. We have a story in Mexico now from apnews.com. Hurricane Otis has caused at least 27 deaths in Acapulco this past Wednesday. It has left the city of 1 million people without power, having downed every power line in the zone where it struck. And without power, the death toll could rise in the days to come. The economic damage has yet to be calculated, but will be very significant. Small farmers especially has had much of their crops devastated by the wind and rain. And the stories from those affected are devastating to witness. Many are upset with authority and the government, as they feel there was insufficient warning for the severity of the storm, and the planned disaster relief was not well prepared, and of course couldn't come quick enough. Otis's transformation from mild to monster came as a great surprise, leaving climate scientists struggling to explain why. It started on Tuesday as a mere tropical storm, strengthening to a Category 5 hurricane as it swept along the coast. In just 24 hours, it went from wind speeds of about 60 miles per hour to well over 150. At landfall, it measured sustained winds of 165 miles per hour. It is now the most intense hurricane on record to make landfall along Mexico's coast. But this failure.
Sorry, people forget that, in fact, the Mexican Revolution of 1910 was the first actual communist revolution before Russia even. And it was a peasant revolution. It was about the small farmers rising up against the ejido farmers, like the small farm collectives, rising up against the big plantation owners who were encroaching more and more on their land and taking more and more away from them.
Yeah, I mean, we can't encourage that sort of thing, of course, but it's interesting to see the response by these the smaller groups, as you say, to the failure of government.
Mexico owes Mexico in its current form owes their existence to them, basically, because they're the ones who rose up against the hacendados, the big hacienda owners.
This failure of modern weather forecasting only showcases the massive changes to our climate is undergoing as well. It's well known that warmer ocean temperatures make for more severe storms. And in case you have to hear it again, it's humanity's actions as a whole that are directly leading to global and ocean warming trends. Ocean temperatures have been at record highs for months. There are more record-breaking storms than ever, and there's no indication it'll get better. The Gulf of Mexico in particular has recorded huge increases in temperature, and as the El Nino event continues to intensify, Mexico and the world should prepare for storms of even greater magnitude.
For our last story, we go to Columbus, the Ohio Capitol Journal, in an October 23rd story entitled "Ohio Supreme Court Decision Clears the Path for Preble County Solar Farm." However, this seemingly good news is not as positive as it might first appear. We reported a few weeks ago about a legal policy established by the U.S. Supreme Court over 30 years ago called Chevron Deference. This is policy that says when laws are ambiguous, the courts should defer to administrative agencies on how to interpret them. The basic idea is that judges who are mostly learned in law do not have the same expertise as scientists or engineers or nuclear technicians when it comes to actually regulating industries. Regulators who have studied the areas they are supposed to regulate will do a better job of actually protecting and serving the public than judges will, who these days are often politically or ideologically motivated. The Ohio Supreme Court has rejected this Chevron deference. Governor Mike DeWine's son, Pat DeWine, wrote an opinion that said, in part, the judicial branch is never required to defer to an agency's interpretation of the law. That was in a case called Twism. So there, the judges set themselves at the top of any state agency by giving themselves veto power and rejecting the very idea of Chevron deference. This week, the Ohio Supreme Court went further and said that the court can reject any rules or actions that an agency makes that it considers unreasonable. Unreasonable is a very broad term that can mean almost anything. For example, if a regulatory agency were to ban fishing for a species because it feared the species would be fished into extinction, a fisherman who makes his living catching that fish could consider the ban unreasonable. In this specific instance, the court examined the arguments of the anti-solar groups one by one. Those suing to stop the solar project made claims about negative effects from noise, appearance, setbacks, and environmental impacts. In each case, the court agreed with the Ohio Power Siting Board to say that those objections were without merit. But the point the court was trying to make by even agreeing to hear the case is that it is entitled to second-guess all the agency's decisions. If Chevron Deference still applied, unless there was some other compelling reason to doubt the agency's decision, the court would simply have let that decision stand. Essentially, the Ohio Supreme Court has made itself the head of every statewide agency. Pat DeWine has already been accused of conflicts of interest. For example, he has refused to recuse himself on cases that directly involved his father, Mike DeWine. Pat DeWine only has a law degree, but now has named himself as the ultimate authority on matters of biology, sociology, engineering, and chemistry. In fact, he gets to decide on the reasonableness of any subject that the state of Ohio regulates. What we can expect from this decision is that any and all regulatory actions any state agency makes will now have to pass through the Ohio Supreme Court before it can be enforced. The court laid out the process in Preble County's solar farm's decision. The Ohio Power Siting Board has a very long, detailed process for approving power plants like solar fields, wind farms, natural gas plants, or even coal plants. What will happen now is that an applicant will go through the years-long, expensive process of receiving OPSB approval and then have to roll the dice one more time to see if they can make it past the Supreme Court. The United States Supreme Court is poised to overturn Chevron deference at the federal level. This will essentially make regulating industries impossible. One of the most powerful decisions any court can make is whether or not to hear a case. In the past, challenges of routine decisions would not have been taken up by the courts unless there was some compelling issue of law in question. By setting the incredibly subjective test of reasonableness as all that is required to appeal an agency decision, the Ohio Supreme Court guarantees enforcement paralysis, as every decision can now be appealed. Well, as I mentioned, I'm in Florida this week, and one of the good things about Florida is how much effort they put into the preservation and restoration of their local ecosystems. This is largely because of how inhospitable some of these marshes are, but nonetheless, it's a treat to see just how wild Florida is. I constantly see lizards and peacocks, and I'm pretty sure I saw a river otter the other night. I'm a few miles away from the Indian River Lagoon, which has been undergoing intentional habitat restoration since 2004, when the land was reclaimed from private farmland. The Indian River Lagoon has actually been noted as a really crucial part of the local ecosystem, providing nursery areas for up to 70% of the local fisheries. It's a critical habitat for a wide variety of birds and other critters, and it's a cool reminder of the good we can do if we focus on reclaiming these smaller areas. Maybe you could find a little passion project of yourself to focus on. But for now, that's it for our show this week. Catch us again next time for more ecological news and stories.
No. I don't want no oil, a spoiling my shoreline. I like fish much better than crud. I like birds and things, creeping and crawling. Won't trade no more oil for blood. The sun done give us all we need to make this country run. But that black demon oil's got us fussing and fighting, and I do believe it's time.